I always worry about when I start in the morning because usually if you've had coffee, you might regret that. Sometimes people have accused me of sounding a little bit like a Baptist preacher when I get to talk about this, and I'm unapologetic about that. I do think that we really are at a crossroads of what impact science can actually have on people, and we've been pushing, particularly I've been pushing this concept of getting beyond the bench to bedside model. It's important to get beyond the bedside because many of our people that we're trying to take care of never make it to our bedsides, which is probably contributing to some of the disparities. So what we're going to try to do is to have a much more holistic thing of what happens if we envision a world where we can get from the bench all the way to the community. And this driving factor of the first words of being respect is actually going to be at the center of everything that we talk about. The early things I'm going to talk about, probably most of you know, so I can probably go through these things a little bit quickly. We'll start with the war. As a cancer center director, one of the things I've always sort of said is that I had to learn the first two Ds. And they were driven by the 1971 Act with under President Nixon when they had the war on cancer. And the two Ds were drug development and device development to cure cancer. Now, inherently, that sounds really cool. And it is really cool because we've certainly made some advances. But what you'll recognize is it's left, I think, a piece of humanity out of our cancer centers where the major driver is attached to device or drug. But there is another graphs laying around. I'm just going to take that and actually write a paper. We're interestingly enough entering into a time that's a little bit more complex, which means we will have to think about this a little bit more. In that backdrop, you have things like this, genomic medicine. Like everyone knows now that that the genome matters. I can even go in a barbershop. I'll attest to this. Now they may not know what the genome is, but they know that it actually matters and they've seen it. And that those tools that can actually develop from that can actually impact their lives. And sadly, most of what I get in the barbershops is that this will affect some but not others. We're in the age of actually recognizing that the average is over. We used to talk about the standard of care. Well, the standard's not always the standard for everyone. And just so if you're counting, I'm not just talking about race. We have technological advances. You guys have seen the commercials now for taking your ECG, which I think, EKG, which I was trying to convince my dad. And he was like, first of all, no. He goes, second, this thing's not a doctor and I need to see my doc. So I was like, okay, Dad, got it. But I'll buy it for you. He goes, well, you can buy it for me if you want. This is another sort of example of essentially a phone that you can hook up to really what's an ultrasound to do sort of two-dimensional echoes and all the rest of these other things. Famously, someone sort of said, where medicine is going is right here in that phone. And unfortunately, what I had to say was, that made me interesting, and so I took out my phone and I had everybody else take out their phone. And I essentially answered one question to the person who believed that we would no longer need the human touch. And so if you're figuring that this is a talk about high tech and high touch, you're right. I actually said to him that if you're on 63rd and King on the south side of Chicago in Inglewood, and they were to pull out their phones, that phone's not the same. And some of the people who actually own these phones have recently returned from places like Juliet, which is sort of the prison, but I guess most of you know the Blues Brothers, so you would have known that. And are disadvantaged from the very beginning. On some of your apps, you need credit cards. There is almost a fascination so much with technology and a drive to sort of say that we have technology that sometimes we really lose the real focus on the impact that we have to have for some, on some but not all. This slide, and some of you have probably seen me show this slide before, and I'm going to continue to show this slide because this is what bothers me and wakes me up, as James Brown would say, in a cold sweat. You can see, probably to your right, there is an area labeled 85. Well, that's called the Gold Coast or the Loop. And that is the average life expectancy within that. But if you follow the blue line, within 4 to 5 stops on the train, we call it the L, you have a substantial reduction in West Garfield Park of 69. Now that's an area that I am in. My cancer center sits between both of those. The saddest part for me is that I literally had to round that up to 69 because it's actually 68.45. But if you do the math, you can round it up to 69. But if you think about that in 2018, this should bother all of us. These are numbers that are actually worse in some of my communities than the life expectancy for Americans in 1976, 1974, and 72. If that's not unacceptable, then I don't know what is. So while, again, many of you have heard me sort of say, and I am all about it, I love science. God knows I love science. And I famously have said, and will continue to say, if loving science is wrong, I don't want to be right. But in that context, what keeps me awake is that we are going to drive, certainly the technologies and the devices will have impacts, but we may inadvertently increase the Gold Coast from 85 to 90, and West Garfield stays at 68. As we talk about what it is that we're trying to do in protecting folks, we also have to actually use another word, and how do we get people to be involved? Because my fear is that this certainly is going to work for some, but maybe not for all, and then what we'll say 10 years from now is that we have a widening gap and we're scratching our heads about why. This is another thing. So let me just tell you that the first few slides are going to be like, but then I got some good slides coming, so don't worry. By the end of this, we'll actually have bridged this gap a little bit. This is a slide that some of you may have seen about why African American mothers and their babies are in a life or death crisis. And this article was in the Times. Mostly, this was trying to sort of indicate that, believe it or not, that the difference between infant mortality and whites and blacks has actually worsened, and is actually at this point even worse than the difference between whites and blacks was in 1850. And I use the right 1850, before slavery ended. How does that happen in a modern world? How does that happen with the advent of all the technologies that we have? How does that happen with all the new knowledge and the new papers and the new online journals that we're actually having that are bringing forth new knowledge? How does this happen? Furthermore, if you look at it, and most of you have probably heard the pregnancies of Beyonce and the pregnancies of Serena Williams that were very difficult, and we were scratching our heads. Well, wait a minute. These are successful women, and yet they've gone out of these neighborhoods. And in fact, you have data that says that if you're an African-American woman with, you can have multiple degrees, that you will have a worse outcome than a Caucasian woman with a high school degree when it comes around infant mortality. How does that happen? Again, what you can look at that and sort of say, well, but there is, again, a science behind that, of not just the science of discovery, but a science that would be called implementation. And so I think we're at the era now where we have been absolutely enthralled by discovery science, and I'm a believer in discovery science, but I'm actually now a more firm convert, if you will, to the science of people, and how do we actually translate that into not just some communities, but all communities. I told you it was going to feel a little bit like Sunday. You're like, wait a minute, but it's only... Now, we have some challenges, and most of us know the historical challenges have been things like what famously is called Tuskegee, but we know it's the United States Public Health sort of study of 1932. But I'm going to say that we are in an interesting period where this is almost like a little bit like a concussion. In a concussion, so I used to play lacrosse and football. What happens is you get the first hit, but then it's that second hit that really does some significant harm. I think as a result of this study and of some of the ills of the past, we are now experiencing the second hit. Let me explain. There was a fear in the neighborhoods about what was being done to them. And as a result of what was being to them, we were introducing a disparity. My fear now, and if some of you are from Oregon, I think you know what I'm talking about, there is an interesting sort of thing that we may be actually also equally guilty of what we're not doing for people at this point. What do I mean by that? As we talk about research and disparities in research, it's clear that we have a lack of minorities and others. Those who are underrepresented in biomedical sciences really are underrepresented in biomedical sciences. And one of those things that I wanted to point out to you is that, for example, in immunotherapy, there are trials right now where we know that this miracle drug that actually has come on the scene, interestingly enough, predominantly does not represent women or minorities. Now, the downside about that is that if you really believe in precision medicine and these things like that, then one has to sort of make the argument, do we really know what it is that we're doing? And as a result now of the past and the future of not involving people, we may actually run the risk of having a drug that might be good for some but not for all. On top of that, you have things like this, and you can substitute any name. I mean, this is just from the political magazine, but you could put on there, say, any name, substitute for Cleveland Clinic. But there's this concept that while you have these wonderful institutions, you can literally go several blocks away and people aren't even accessing the care. I'll say that again. In some of our most wonderful, our most esteemed, our most highly ranked, some of our top USA News, World Report institutions, within blocks, those same people are going to other hospitals. There is a disconnect. Part of this is historic, and I won't spend too much time on the redlining issue, but I think most of you in the room understand that in the 1930s, there was a deliberate decision made to sort of separate the races, and one of the ways is to sort of figure out what housing and what areas you can buy. But I want to say that as a result of that, Chicago in particular has suffered because both our north and west sides of town and are plagued with some of the lowest resources and some of the highest mortality. Now, the funny part about that, it doesn't really matter. You could take poor education, it would be on the north and south, on the west and south sides of town. Highest infant mortality, it would be on the west and south sides of town. It's interesting that almost every measure you can pick, you can take the same thing and it overlays. And not to be cognizant of the structural things that were put in place more than God knows, a while ago in the 1930s, are still playing a role now. It's not that it doesn't exist, we just have not been aware and conscious of. So part of this respect factor is raising the consciousness of really not ignoring our past, but understanding how that past continues to contribute to impacting what we see today as we still march in our progressive manner, which is true in our drugs and devices. And I'm not anti-drugs and devices, believe me. I'm going to go back to my lab. I love DNA binding protein, and God knows on Saturday I'll be doing a little bit of that myself. But there is a humility that has to look at how is these things and how is this new knowledge impacting. This is a slide that I don't know if you could see, but it was a little bit like pin the tail on my donkey. When my daughter, Layla, saw this slide, I told her what this slide was. I go, well, she goes, Dad, I thought you told me that the west and south sides of Chicago were where the worst mortality was for breast cancer. And I said, yeah, and she's in high school, so she's a smarty pants. So, she says, well, the pink is, in this case, is representing where the most mortality. And I go, yeah. And she goes, well, I thought you said the program that you were supposed to roll out, which was for better screening, which was done by essentially the American College of Radiological Breast Imaging Centers of Excellence. And I said, yeah, well, these things are supposed to elevate. And she said, well, then how come none of the pink ribbons where those centers are actually on the pink? And I looked and I was like, well, Layla, I was like, well, you're right. And she goes, so, in a typical sort of high school, so since you're the cancer center director, Dad, you should fix that. Yeah, that'll do. I'll work on that right now. But to my amazement, it was interesting that we had things that were potentially near, but never directly in the center of the storm. And someone said, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Sometimes I argue that we are not always where the action is. And we should be, again, cognizant of that. Now, part of what I've just described to you is this, not emerging, because it's been around since 1969, this concept of, we'll come up with a better term for it at some point, but for now what it's called is this context of, I call it history impacting the current, whether you're talking about current diseases and all the rest of that, but it's this kind of context in which you have a social structure, right, or a social institution that harms some and benefits others. Now, in this context, there's a lot of work being done around structural violence these days. In fact, there's structural violence grants, and we have a Center of Excellence grant around this, in which we're looking at how the structure actually impacts chronic diseases. And so I can tell you about that a little bit more later. But it looks a little like this. And the story with this that some of you know, I had a patient once who had more than a 50-pound weight loss and was a good guy, and had just recently lost his job. And we were, had been to multiple hospitals to get workup, and we were about to launch into $1 million workup for this guy because I had my righteousness and my team, we were ready to go, and we were going to fight for every bill and pay for it. And then it just so happened that before we started the workup, I just simply answered one question. Hey, how are you doing? He goes, I don't know, I just lost. I go, wait a minute. I go, you've been losing a lot of weight. He goes, yeah. I go, how's your food? I said, well, man, I haven't really been eating. And all of a sudden, it dawned on me. We were so entranced in our technologies and so entranced in our workup that we forgot to answer just the basic human question, because we are so, again, implicitly biased that, well, everyone eats and everyone has a car, and that we forgot to have the humility just to simply answer the question, what's your living situation like? It's amazing how frequently that these things happen. So, the hope, to be quite honest with you, is that I know that many people may not have seen the initial launch of the Precision Medicine Initiative or the All of Us program as being a step. I mean, there are many other steps, but a step to finally starting to bring a consciousness of building a bridge between the bench and the science to the community. And I thought that President Obama's statement about, my hope is that this becomes the foundation, the architecture, whereby in 10 years from now we can look back and say that we have revolutionized medicine. And one of the underscore revolutionized medicine that I would put in there is that we don't just say we have people at the table anymore. In fact, we're famously for saying we just have to be at the table. And I remind people that centerpieces are also at the center of the table frequently. Sometimes we treat our community partners like centerpieces. They're beautiful, frequently quiet, and after the meeting, it gets tossed in a corner somewhere. In this context of trying to figure out what the voices of the community needs, because I do think it will not only help refine and define, but I think it would actually help us give a type of humility, because when I've been in the community, and literally talking with all the aldermen in my section and the faith leaders, but also some of the community leaders that are there, it has been humbling for me to understand that all the time there was some knowledge there that they already had, they just couldn't articulate it in our language or in our canon. And sometimes I've been really leery these days of the language that we use, and sort of saying that the language that we use sometimes has really been an ability to keep some people out and keep us in. You know what I mean by that? We use terms and we sort of say to people, well, if you don't understand how to use these specific terms in epidemiology, then you clearly don't know. I would argue that my grandma knows a whole lot more than some of the people I met along the way, even in academia. Now, she sounds different, but it's the same point. So in this context, I do think that getting back to the community and engaging the community in a way in which at the very beginning of things, we're not just hearing their voices, we are literally hearing them. is going to be a challenge for the 21st century, and one that I embrace. It's important to actually have these technologies in our communities and have our communities understand what role they have in them, because this story, and I call this the tale of two outcomes. We know Eric Dishman, and I've come to know and love Eric Dishman, and really I think he's outstanding in every way. One of the things that we all know about Eric, who's leading the All of Us program, is that he is a benefactor, direct benefactor of this technology of precision medicine. With his renal cell carcinoma, by all rights, he probably shouldn't be here today. And imagine he's now the head of one of the biggest programs at the NIH because of the technology. I'm also reminded that the person to your right is also a pretty amazing person, was a pretty amazing person. His name was DJ Timbuktu. His real name is Timothy Jones. But DJ Timbuktu was probably, you may not know, but if anybody listens to things like Common and even some hip hop artists that have just been, doing one, Kendrick Lamar, all the rest of these people, way before. This guy had done most of their music, laid down the tracks. He too had renal cell carcinoma. Unfortunately, he did not have the benefits of the technology and passed. And was, by the time he thought about it, was so afraid of the mistrust and distrust of the system, on top of the fact that it wasn't just offered to him, he passed at a fairly early age. So, why do I believe in the All of Us program, and why do I believe in this approach of sort of saying, how do we actually get something that belongs to the people? How do we actually start building our research so that it's, and again, I'm talking to the choir here because we all believe in the same thing, but this reminds me of the personal fight that these programs that we do, sort of connecting it in a way to our communities. There are three basic points to this, and you're going to hear a lot more about it. One is nurturing the relationships, getting over 1 million people to actually get a database that could be shared across many people. It's also making the data that's collected accessible to not just for some, but hopefully to many. And actually being able to generate new thoughts and new ideas, not just from the top tier elite institutions, but folks who are from our community colleges and our citizen scientists. There are definitely some cornerstones and some other things that you'll hear about. But one of the cornerstones for me that is not really reflected here is this concept of trying to get diversity in our research, but I think trying to connect what it is that we're doing to them and making it matter. You would be surprised at the number of people who, I've read articles that said, well, African Americans don't want to participate in these programs. They just don't want to participate in research. It's depending on who you talk to. When you get real, and up in my vernacular, up on the south side of Chicago, we said keeping it 100, just in case. When we're keeping it 100, it turns out that many of the preachers and the pastors and some of the community leaders simply just said, you've never really asked. And you've never really asked in an appropriate way that it either understood or that it would resonate with us. And one of the things I learned as a missions dean once in my life, which I wasn't a missions dean, was that we were at a school that says, well, University of Colorado, minorities just don't come here. And I said, well, what's the highest you got? Well, we were at 7% one year. Man, we spent couple million dollars on that, and that was just hard. And I sort of said, well, have you ever checked whether your message is resonating? Fast forward, probably within my second, third year, we were over 30%. And in my fifth year, we were over 42%. Those guys actually matched and did really well. And then someone, said to me, how did this happen? We spent $15 million once before, and you spent, which I will never do this again. When I took the job, I said, well, we have this much money. I go, I could do that for half the money. They gave me half the money. True story. I learned from that. Never say that again, so I won't. But the lessons that they had learned was that it wasn't that there was something magic. It was really about more of a humanistic sort of sense of an approach. There was also a sense that this concept of passivity, what I call it, well, if we get students in and we send out flyers, I said to my dean at the time, I said, if I were your head coach of your basketball team, Or if I were your head coach of your football team, you would have different expectations. And he said, what? You would have the expectations that I would be actively recruiting and actively developing pipelines and actively going out and developing new pipelines to bring you the best athletes. And he thought about it. He says, well, isn't that what we do? I go, no. What you do is you sort. You send an announcement out, people come to you and whatever you have, you kind of sort through it and say, well, now we have that, right? I go, this concept of being intentional, of going into these communities, intentional going into the North Carolina A&Ts, intentional of going into some of these things and finding our best and brightest that sometimes are in places that you would never guess and aren't there because they're not smart. They're there sometimes because of different circumstances. The intentionality of really reaching out does matter. To that end, you'll hear about really the transformational approaches, I think, for this program with this diversity and with this access to data. But what I'm most proud of is that it changes this concept of me as a PI coming up with just an interesting idea and then running and sort of saying, I'm going to now recruit 5,000 people. So now we have multiple, maybe 100 of these things where we have between 1,000, 10,000 people. What would actually happen if you already built that and you had 2 million, 3 million people in a database and we were able to access it? There is an element of this program in particular that I like because this is a program that says it doesn't just belong to the researchers, it belongs to us. Which means if a citizen scientist can put together a proposal and do it the right way, they too can answer questions sometimes about their neighborhoods. In fact, I love the concept of citizen scientists because it comes right out of the environmental type stuff back in the 1970s, where these were the people who were helping people to develop and go get soils and things and participating. And where is it that we, in our research, that we're asking our community to really be participants in our research, other than we're getting their blood? What about the act of, again, the early days of having people from the community who really wanted to know what the soil was like, who wanted to know what the water was like? What would happen if we changed that and we sort of said, how do we do that at the beginning, that we're getting every neighborhood involved in some really real ways in sort of collecting also our data and being a part of it? I think this gives us an opportunity. We know that people have differences in the context of their disease risks. We're well aware of the variable drug responses. I mean, people know about Ambien, that Ambien doesn't work the same way in everyone. Lipitor and other drugs like that. Back in the day, we were given that out like water. We understood that actually that did work, but for some it had completely adverse effects. I think we are on the age of sort of saying what happens in the context of person-based medicine. But I do want to make sure that the reason why this respect and the reason why this community thing matters to me is because I think we've only been clapping with one hand. And again, I am an offender. As many of us, I've been very myopic in the context of my drive for devices and new technologies and new drug development I have. But I've forgotten that where you live actually also matters. And as a medical student and as a resident and as a fellow and as a junior faculty, I rarely really asked people about where they lived. And then once they told me where they lived, I really never even looked at the zip code and sort of said, well, what else is going on beyond that? It was just sort of internet, right? But this concept of where you live, the social construct of where you live does matter. And let me kind of go on to say why. This is a case of ZNA versus DNA. That is your zip code at birth versus your deoxyribonucleic acid, or your genetic code. And I want to make the case for you that your geography probably matters. And as a result of geography mattering, I think our approach to how we do research, how we engage, how we build trust also should change. Two sisters. In this case, they're raised together in the same town, they're in the same home, under the same circumstances. And like all kids, they grow up and they move. And they move away. One sister decides to move to the Gold Coast, and she has, what would by all indications would be a wonderful life. It's a high-income area. You want to talk about fresh fruits, they have fresh fruits everywhere. Farmers' gardens, gyms, they have gyms so good that some of them you can't even get in, it's so expensive. But anyways, we'll leave that, that's a topic for another time, that you can't get into a gym to work out. Anyways, I'll leave that alone. Healthy society, but anyways, I'll leave that alone. top hospitals, all these other things. The other system moves really to Moline, which you can sort of see is near Rock Island. And for most of you who know Illinois, you would actually know that Moline is definitely the exact opposite. High poverty, unfortunately high unemployment, higher rates of everything in context of cancer, et cetera, et cetera. So the question I've always had is, it's easy when we say, well, black versus white, this is what we've been saying, well, genetically, well, of course, men versus women, but when you're from the same genetic stock and you grow up in the same sort of circumstances, the issue is, for me, if they both get breast cancer, do we treat them the same? If we're really in this context of precision-based medicine and really being sensitive to the individual, do we sort of say to them, well, your sister had this, so this is the way we used to do it. It turns out, though, if you take a step for a second and you think that geography matters, and if you really believe the science of the microbiome, and that is what you have access in the food and the gut flora and all the rest of that stuff actually has now impacts on your genetics. And if you believe really the epigenetics, that is the things that are happening around you, the stresses, the violence, the everyday issues of how to actually make a paycheck go from day to day, and that the epigenetic variables also impact your genetics, then the answer may not be so simple as, well, of course you would get the same therapy. We are in an age right now where information matters, and I want to talk about that other D. That last D is data. We're in an age right now where data is king. Oil used to be, but data is king. But whose data and how do we disseminate that data back to our communities is really, for me, the exciting part of what we actually have the ability to do right now. One example, and I know this is off script, but I'm just going to take a couple minutes, is that we recognize that data is an issue. And we decided that most of us are looking because we're using the data. It's almost like we don't recognize who's collecting the data. There are people who collect the data. This is a little bit of my 10-year-old, at the time 10-year-old, his name was Jamal, son, and I literally was marveling at pictures of our house. I was like, wow, that Google, that's amazing. How does that satellite do it? And my 10-year-old said, Dad, he goes, it's not the satellite. I go, what do you mean? Look at these pictures. He goes, Dad, there's actually someone who gets paid to drive in a car with a camera on top. I was like, oh. But it also brought this reality back to me that the data is being collected from somewhere. And at this point, let's just take cancer. We have, cancer registrars that are collecting these data. That's a 2-year associate's degree. What would happen if we actually sort of said, we understand that it's going to be more electronic, that it's going to be more complicated, that it's going to be bigger. Why haven't we actually sort of said, why are we not developing, almost like for those of you who have seen Hidden Figures? This is another opportunity. I come from a land-grant institution, University of Illinois, so famous for in the context of agriculture and engineering and bringing those working class kids and elevate. This is an opportunity for us, if we're thinking around data, to also not just get data, but to give some of these communities like jobs and careers. So we're going to be launching the first 4-year degree in sort of what we're calling, the registrar's sort of platform at University of Illinois, and we're going to be working with our Malcolm X community colleges and other things like that to say, what if you were able to now have something that you are actually on the front end directing us on how we can better get the data more accurately from our communities? Because there's a lot of, we call it pharmacy deserts, food deserts, but I'm going to tell you there's a lot of data deserts that we're just blind to. Imagine if that data were collected in a respectful way and that involved the community, that helped also gainfully employ the community in a thoughtful, in a humble, and in a deliberate way, so that we, again, not only would be able to build trust, but hopefully be able to build a conscience that those folks within those communities who already have the agency would be able to tell us, that's not right. And you're not going to get if you really want to get the better data, it'll come this way. And have the humility to say, all right, let's look at this. We are on an age right now where I think data is actually going to be helpful in bringing us together, because it will, I think, force us to think about things differently. I showed this slide, but this one just there's a lot of slides that just piss me off. This is one of them. In Cook County, of the 3,141 counties, we're the top 10 in every cancer death. Anyways, I can't even show anymore the thing around cervical cancer. It's just because no one should be dying of cervical cancer, and yet we have in some areas 2.5 times the increased deaths around cervical cancer, which is preventable. That again gives us an opportunity for thinking, how do we actually engage our community? Literally engage our community around these preventable issues. So I'm actually excited. I know that someone said to me once, they go, well, that stuff, the implementation, the dissemination, I don't know. He goes, don't you have more fun in the lab? And I said, yeah, well, I go, this is a little bit like Carl Benz versus the Henry Ford. Henry Ford's not super sexy. Carl Benz, when you think of the Benz, your first combustible engine, it belonged to only the elite of the elite. And then this crazy guy like Ford and the Dodgers and other things were like, what would happen if it belonged to everybody? So, make it mass, right? So again, I'll be transparent. I want these technologies and devices not to work for some. Whether it's in Beattyville, Kentucky, whether it's in the South Shore of Chicago, whether it's in some of the west sides of Philadelphia, I want this to work everywhere. I think we have forgotten that we have another partner in this ability to get to our communities, and that is our federally qualified health centers. And I know that most of you know that our federally qualified health centers came from the war on poverty. I have a second hat that I wear in which I oversee federally qualified health centers, a total of 13 of them throughout the south and west sides of Chicago. And it turns out that there is an interesting campaign on integration of the federally qualified health centers into some of these approaches. Let me just show you why data matters. I had this concept that I was in these clinics, and it turns out that in some of these clinics, they have wards, 50 wards. So the crazy part about when you talk to people about data, when you say things like, in your catchment area, people go, they'll smile and nod, Well, in your community area, But when you give them something that they understand in this neighborhood or in this part of the holler or in this ward, people then actually can internalize that in a way in which it means something to them. So we did an experiment. We sort of said, I was totally naive. I said, well, give me some data that's ward-based data for Chicago, because I want to be able to go out to all the aldermen and talk to them in a way that they would understand. And the funny part about it was that they were like, nobody has those data. Like, what do you mean you don't collect the data by wards? They were like, we have community area, we have catchment, we have these other things. But I was like, yeah, but what about the alderman? So I spoke with an alderman who had the best line I ever heard. He goes, yeah, you guys come to me. Well, first of all, what happened, truth story. I went into his office, and I was supposed to have a half-an-hour meeting. He made it a 5-minute meeting, and he said, listen, if you're coming down here, that means something's bad's happening to me. He goes, you folks have never been out here. I was like, no. This is when I had come from Colorado, so I was just so Colorado. I was like, hey, we're just going to sit and talk. Long story short, we had a great conversation. That led to us actually really recognizing that many of the aldermen and the people that we say are leading these areas that really want to be involved in health have no data. They say people talk at them, and they're being talked at, and at the end of the day, they just nod and say, okay, great, but nothing happens, and then we get frustrated because we have not done this concept of the bilingualism of science. And I think that there is a bilingualism of science. And what I mean by that is there is the language that we talk amongst ourselves, and then there's the language that we will speak with our community. And interestingly enough, I've now run a program through our patient brigade where I am pairing up people from the community with our researchers so that they can actually have another real additional language so that when they go in the communities, there is a connectedness. I'll give you a quick example of why this matters. This is Willie Cochran from the 20th Ward, and we had his regular demographics and all the rest of that stuff, and we can actually map out his ward. But one of the things that we were able to do is the following. We were able to make this very real for the 20th Ward. This not only mattered to the aldermen, but this mattered to the local hospitals, to the churches, who we were having debates, interestingly enough, because they were being told, don't get screened, in this case for prostate. But if you can look at some of the prostate numbers, and I'm almost ending, so again, I'll leave you alone. But if you can look at that, the prostate in West Englewood was 3 times the amount of death, so this is death than national or than the rest of the state. And we looked at that number, and it turns out that this was a defining conversation for not only this alderman and the local community hospitals, but for some of the community groups that then said, this is us. So what do we do? The conversation turned from, well, doc, what are you guys going to do in here, to what are we going to do? And what I'm saying to you is that the public, particularly our communities, are hungry for things that are presented in a way that they can connect to and that they can also own and be a part of. And so we do have to pay attention to our language. That totally sounds totally hippie granola, but I'm unapologetic for it. But we really do have to start figuring what is that language and what can we learn from our community in the context of being better communicators of that language so that they are connected. I think at the end I'm going to leave you guys alone because I know this is probably not the best way to start off a morning with me, because I think I am pretty intense and I wish I could say something different. It's just that I really think we're at a crossroads and at a time that you cannot convince me that we've come along at the right time. And I think everyone in this room has the right energy and the right ideas about respect, 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 and I'm going to add to that, beyond respect, how do we really get how do we get our communities involved in a way so that they're not centerpieces and not just being at the table, when we can say things that just being at the table ain't good enough. We're taking our game up higher. We're there. And I really feel great of being amongst you all, because this is, again, another way of sort of saying to us why we're doing what we're doing and why the time is now. So with that, I will end and entertain any questions. But if it looks like I'm really super stoked about what we're doing, I am. So I'll take any questions if you have them. Thank you.